If you found your way here tonight, then perhaps, like me, you have a quiet fascination with the strange and delicate corners of history. The moments that didn't make the textbooks, the lives lived in candlelight and silence, and the curious souls who stood just a little off stage, behind the throne, or beside the feast, waiting, always waiting. Before we begin, make yourself comfortable, brew something warm if you'd like, and if you're enjoying these slow wanderings through the past, I'd be ever so grateful if you'd leave a like and subscribe. It helps keep the fire burning here. And do let me know in the comments below where in the world you're watching from tonight. It's always a quiet joy to see where our little circle of insomniac historians are tuning in from. Now then, let us step into the shadowed halls of medieval power, where behind every banquet there lurked a question far more pressing than etiquette. Is it safe to eat? Have you ever sat down to dinner, looked at your meal and thought, I do hope this isn't poisoned? No? Then congratulations, you are probably not a 14th century monarch. Because for many nobles of the medieval world, dining wasn't just an affair of taste and table manners. It was a matter of life and death. Tonight, we venture beyond the banquet hall and into the quiet, anxious world of the medieval food and drink tester, a peculiar figure whose job was as noble as it was nerve-wracking. The unsung, occasionally unlucky sentinels of safety, whose tongue and stomach formed the final line of defense between their lord's appetite and an early grave. Pour yourself a mug of spiced wine, or perhaps something less suspicious, and settle in. The fire is warm, the hall is quiet, and the story, as always, begins long before the first bite. Long before the dish was served, the meal was a production. In the cavernous kitchens of great halls and castles, fires crackled under blackened cauldrons, and sweating cooks stirred pots with paddles large enough to row a small boat. Every stew, pie, and roast passed through dozens of hands, squires, scullions, spitboys, kitchen maids, each with their own tasks and their own secrets. And so, in a world where enemies lurked behind courtly smiles, and bitter rivals might offer a gift loaf laced with just a little too much seasoning, the idea of poison was more than paranoia. It was protocol. Enter the food tester. Now, contrary to popular imagination, they weren't always trembling peasants dragged in to nibble at the royal roast like sacrificial mice. In fact, food testers were often professionals, well paid, trusted, sometimes even noble-born themselves. In the courts of Europe, particularly during the later Middle Ages, food tasting wasn't just a safety measure. It was a symbol, a performance of trust. But don't be too reassured. Trust, after all, is a wonderful thing, right up until it isn't. Let us visit the court of Richard II. The year is 1385. The feast is grand. Swans, redressed in their own plumage, are paraded to the table. A boar's head grins from a silver platter, and marzipan castles glimmer with candied banners. But behind this dazzling theatre of wealth and gluttony, a quiet ritual unfolds. Before the king raises his goblet or breaks his bread, the steward of the household nods toward the tester, a solemn young man in a velvet doublet who steps forward and samples each dish with a wooden spoon and practiced caution. The goblet is sipped, the meat is tasted, the tester then stands back and waits. If he dies, well, dinner is cancelled. But more often than not, he simply lives, somewhat unpoisoned and slightly overfed, as the king tucks in, reassured that tonight's meal will not be his last. Of course, medieval poison wasn't always instant. It wasn't a cartoon puff of smoke or a dramatic fall into a soup tureen. Many poisons were slow, subtle, and symptomless, for a while at least. So the notion of the tester's safety being any real guarantee, a bit of a gamble. And yet, there they were, faithfully nibbling. Poison wasn't just the realm of scheming nobles either. In the religious institutions of Europe, monasteries, abbeys, and bishops' palaces, food and drink testers had a quieter but no less serious role. You see, monks weren't immune to intrigue. The politics of the church could be as cutthroat as any king's court, and disputes over land, heresy, or succession could all come to a boil over a cup of mead. Some monasteries kept tasters during periods of internal tension, or after receiving particularly generous food donations from suspicious patrons. The testers here were often chosen from the lay brothers, those not sworn to full monastic vows, who may have drawn the short straw or owed a favour. They didn't often write about it in their illuminated manuscripts, but one imagines there were a few prayers uttered before each taste. Now, you might be wondering, how exactly did these testers test? Was there a system, a science? Well, sort of. In many noble households, the tester's duties were part of a broader choreography known as the livery of the table. This was a deeply ceremonial process involving elaborate steps for verifying the safety of the meal. A cupbearer would pour the wine and cover the goblet. The food would be sampled, then assayed, cut open to check for strange textures, colours or smells. Some testers would rub meat or wine on their skin, believing that if it blistered or tingled, poison was present. Others dipped silver spoons into stews, convinced the metal would tarnish in the presence of arsenic. And of course, there were the more mystical methods, incantations, prayers, or the wearing of certain protective stones, like bezoars, thought to neutralize poison by simply being nearby. They didn't. The logic ranged from scientific to enthusiastic guesswork, but it all fed into a sense of control in a world where life was fragile, medicine was mostly guesswork, and the average noble had at least 3 cousins who wanted them dead by Christmas. Of all medieval states, Venice perhaps took poisoning the most seriously. The Venetian Republic was a place of shadowy dealings and masked diplomacy, where assassins might poison a rival's oysters on the Grand Canal and slip away under a crescent moon. Venetian authorities employed professional poison experts, not just testers, but doctors trained to detect and counteract poisons. In some cases, they kept antidotes in their state treasuries, next to the golden jewels. One such substance was known as theriac, a strange, sticky paste made of dozens of ingredients, including opium, myrrh, cinnamon, viper's flesh, and a healthy dose of hope. It was believed to cure everything from snakebite to treachery. Did it work? Probably not, but it tasted strong enough to make you forget why you were worried. It is tempting to view the food tester as a tragic, expendable pawn, a figure doomed to sniff danger with every bite. But in truth, they were part of a delicate dance of power, perception, and performance. Much like the tester's silver spoon, their role gleamed with symbolic polish. To test the king's food was, in a way, to place oneself between ruler and ruin, and that, in a world defined by hierarchy and spectacle, was both noble and necessary. Their presence reassured the guests, soothed the host, and reminded everyone that no matter how sweet the wine or golden the goose, trust had to be tasted before it could be swallowed. Let's take a moment to talk about spoons. Not the most thrilling of subjects, perhaps, but in medieval Europe, a spoon, especially a silver one, could be a tool of survival. It was believed by many that silver could detect poison, If the spoon blackened or tarnished, it meant danger was present. In some courts, elaborate silver cups or tasting plates were crafted for this very reason, used not for their elegance, but their supposed powers of detection. Unfortunately, most of this wasn't quite true. Silver will tarnish, yes, but not from arsenic or belladonna. Still, the belief endured. It was the idea of protection, more than the protection itself, that mattered. And in the medieval world, the idea was often enough. Some testers wore charms sewn into their sleeves, amulets made of coral, bone, or stone. The wealthiest wore bezoars around their necks, hard, undigested lumps taken from the stomachs of goats or cows, thought to neutralize any toxin. People paid fortunes for these objects. Entire cabinets of curiosities were filled with them, each one labeled and treasured like a relic of sainthood. And though science has since rendered them more decorative than useful, the belief in their power lasted centuries. But let us not forget, the most important tool a food tester had was time. Imagine the daily routine of a royal tester. He wakes before the cooks. His room, though modest, is located close to the kitchens, not for convenience, but for vigilance. He tastes raw ingredients, sniffs wines fresh from the cask, samples broths in progress, and watches the kitchen staff with a gaze both weary and alert. He is not just a taster, he is a witness, a watcher. And by the time the food arrives at the high table, he's already sampled each dish at least once, perhaps twice. But still, custom requires a final taste, in view of the royal household. The real danger, of course, doesn't come from the kitchen maid peeling carrots. It comes from higher up, a rival duke, a jealous cousin, a steward with divided loyalties. Poison wasn't a weapon of the commoner. It was a tool of the educated, the political, the desperate. And when a meal was poisoned, it was often subtle. A powder sprinkled on the rim of a goblet, a broth thickened with crushed seeds. Sometimes the dish wouldn't even taste wrong, just a little sweeter than expected, or bitter, or oddly metallic. The tester might notice, he might not. He might begin to sweat 20 minutes later, or tremble, or drift into a confused silence, mistaken at first for reverence. And then, well, that was the risk. Consider the case of Count Guy of Flanders, whose food tester famously collapsed during a feast in 1320 after sipping from a wine cup meant for the count. The man died by the next morning. It caused a scandal throughout the region, and although the count was unharmed, it shifted the politics of his court dramatically. Suspicion fell on a rival noblewoman whose household had gifted the vintage. A quiet investigation followed. Allegiances changed. 2 marriages were annulled. The tester's name, sadly, was never recorded, which, in a way, was typical. These figures existed in the margins of history, remembered not by name, but by role, by function. When they succeeded, they were invisible. When they failed, they were very visible indeed. And so we must ask, how real was the threat? Was poison truly so common that testers were necessary? Or was it more fear than fact? Historians debate this. Certainly, poisonings did occur. Belladonna, hemlock, arsenic, all were known. Recipes for poisons appeared in apothecaries' books, cloaked in euphemism or metaphor. Some were designed to paralyze, others to cause vomiting or hallucinations, and some to kill swiftly and without trace. But just as often, the fear of poison was political, a way to display one's enemies as cunning and sinister, a way to justify suspicion, to place a subtle veil of drama over a dinner party. The act of using a tester didn't just say, "I fear for my life." It said, "I am important enough to be feared." The job was lonely, isolating in fact. While the court celebrated, the food tester lingered in quiet suspense, watching himself for symptoms that might never come. Some described the sensation as a kind of self-haunting. The body became suspicious to its own occupant. Did that wine taste sharp? Was the stew too salty? Is that headache from nerves or nightshade? There were no emergency rooms, no antidotes beyond superstition. And so, in the hours after a feast, the tester would retire quietly to his room, light-headed and wary, wondering if his stomach might betray him in the night. Most survived. Some did not. While the courts of England and France had their testers and tasters, it was in the glittering corridors of Byzantium that the art of poisoning, and the precautions against it, became nearly theatrical. In the court of the Eastern Roman Empire, food was not merely nourishment. It was a display of divine favor, of cosmic hierarchy, and where the stakes were higher, so too were the precautions. Every item placed before the emperor was first examined by multiple officials. The sacellarios, or chamberlain, oversaw the preparation. The domesticos supervised the serving, and the food tester, often a eunuch or senior servant, sampled each dish while others watched, not in private, but publicly, with ceremony, sometimes even with witnesses. One emperor is said to have required his food tester to eat every third bite of a dish, literally sharing his meal bite for bite. A strangely intimate and undeniably tense arrangement. But even with all this care, there were incidents. In the 11th century, Emperor Romanos III reportedly fell ill shortly after a bath and dinner. His death was sudden, and rumors immediately swirled, not of infection or stroke, but of poisoning. His wife Zoe, a famously ambitious empress, was quietly accused. Historians still debate what truly happened, but what's certain is that Romanos had a food tester, and what's curious is that the tester survived. Was the poison administered after the tasting? Was it in the wine? Or, as some whispered, was the tester part of the plan? History does not tell us, it merely hints. Further east, in the Abbasid Caliphate, centered in Baghdad, court intrigue reached similar heights. The caliphs of the Golden Age were not only scholars and poets, but also figures of great paranoia. Many caliphs employed personal physicians who doubled as testers, men like Al-Razi and Ibn Sina, who understood not just health, but pharmacology and poisons. These early polymaths were expected to taste, diagnose, and sometimes counteract any signs of tampering. In some cases, foods were accompanied by elaborate rituals. Fragrances were tested. Cups were washed in front of the ruler. Even servants were made to taste the meal again at the table, seconds before it reached the ruler's lips. Poison was feared not just for its lethality, but for its elegance. It left no blood, no noise, no scandal, only a quiet collapse at the edge of a cushion. As knowledge of poisons grew, so too did the knowledge of how to hide them. Certain poisons were tasteless. Others could be baked into pies, stirred into gravy, or disguised in wine spiced with clove and cinnamon. By the 15th century, apothecaries knew of dozens of fatal substances, from the crushed seeds of the yew tree to extracts of monkshood and hellebore. Even crushed pearls and gold leaf were rumoured to be used, though that may have simply been a flex. And so food testers, those patient, unsung figures, remained the final defence in a world where a feast could double as a funeral. But they were not always successful. Florence, 1492. Lorenzo de' Medici, the famed Florentine statesman known as Il Magnifico, became gravely ill after a suspicious meal late in life. Though he survived barely, the cause was debated. Poison, illness, divine retribution. The Medici were notorious for employing tasters, yet even they could not escape suspicion. And in a bitter twist, the family would go on to use poison as much as they feared it, employing it in subtle acts of political cleansing over the following century. By the time of Catherine de' Medici, entire mythologies had formed around the supposed arsenic libraries and poison rings of the Florentine court. While some of it was exaggerated, well, quite a bit of it, it reflected a deeper truth, that food was never just food. It was currency, power, temptation, and sometimes a weapon. As the Renaissance dawned, science grew, and along with it, skepticism. Courts became less theatrical in their fears and more clinical. Physicians began studying poisons in earnest. Antidotes were standardized. Regulations appeared in royal courts forbidding servants from tasting food too far in advance, as poisoning methods had adapted to delay effects by hours. Eventually, the food tester became a ceremonial figure, a holdover of ancient paranoia, still present, still sampling, but with less risk. In time, the title would fade, but the tension remains, tucked quietly in the corners of historical memory. That quiet moment before the first bite, that second glance at the goblet, that old whisper of doubt. Is it safe? The fires have gone out. The platters have been cleared. All that remains is a faint scent of wine, a few scattered crumbs and silence. And somewhere, long after the guests have retired, the food tester sleeps, or tries to. For centuries, these figures walked a fine line between servitude and protection, between obscurity and necessity. They rarely made history, but they often enabled it. Quietly, faithfully, they stood between monarch and meal, bearing the burden of suspicion so that others could dine in ease. But food testing was never just about safety. It was ritual, a kind of liturgy of power, an act that said, this life is worth protecting, that the one eating the roast swan or gilded pears was valuable enough to warrant a human shield in silk gloves and nervous eyes. In this way, the food tester was both servant and symbol, a reminder that even kings are vulnerable. It is easy to romanticize the role until one remembers the stomach cramps, the headaches, the gnawing doubt that followed each shift. Many testers lived in a state of suspended anxiety. They were watched just as closely as they watched the food. A single complaint, a sour face, a cough, a moment's hesitation could cause a scandal, a panic. In some courts, an entire meal would be thrown out if the tester sneezed. There was no room for error, and yet errors happened. Some testers were complicit in poisonings, bribed or threatened. Others were scapegoats, imprisoned or executed for crimes they didn't commit. A few survived poisonings, but were never quite the same afterward. And most went unrecorded, unnamed, lost in the annals of noble households and forgotten ledgers. Their work didn't leave monuments, but it left a peculiar kind of legacy. Even today, heads of state often have food tasters, though their role is more discreet. In some governments, meals are prepared by trusted chefs under surveillance. In others, multiple identical dishes are prepared, and one is chosen at random. In some rare cases, yes, someone still eats first. And there's something ancient in that gesture, something deeply human. The knowledge that trust can be eaten, that fear can linger, even in silver spoons and well-guarded kitchens. We don't often think about food in terms of risk, but for most of history, eating was exactly that. A quiet wager. On the cook, on the supplier, on the people at your table. Which is why the food tester, though a minor figure, held such weight. Their job was not to cook, nor to serve, nor to judge. Their job was simply this: to taste first, to suffer first if need be, to carry, in silence, the fears that others could not afford to show. In the long theatre of history, they stood not in the spotlight, but just beyond it, a little to the left, a little behind, close enough to catch the king's gaze, but not his praise. They were anonymous, often nervous, sometimes brave, and they were very, very important. Because in a world where every meal could be your last, someone had to take the first bite. To the medieval mind, poison was not a scientific phenomenon. It was not a molecule with a measurable half-life or an equation on a blackboard. It was something older, slipperier, a whisper in the blood, a force both feared and half believed, half alive, in a world lit by fire where death could come from a fever, a miasma, or the bite of an unseen devil in the night. Poison held a singular kind of power. It could be slipped silently into the world you trusted most, your dinner, your goblet, your guest, and perhaps worst of all, you might never know it until it was too late. Poison was not just about how someone died, it was about why, and even more troublingly, who. In many ways, medieval poison was not a substance at all. It was a story, a suggestion, a lingering doubt that outlasted the body. And so we begin, not in the apothecary's shop or the shadowed banquet hall, but in the mind of a monk. A scribe hunched over vellum in the scriptorium, copying out a 12th century herbal. His ink-stained fingers are steady. His breath is calm. He writes, "The juice of the belladonna plant, if applied to the eyes, causes visions. If drunk, it causes madness and death. This is the work of Saturn, the cold planet, the slow one." In this worldview, every poison had a humor, an element, a planetary influence. Belladonna was cold and dry. Hemlock belonged to Saturn. Aconite was ruled by Mars. This was not a metaphor. This was the order of things. To poison someone was not just to interrupt the body. It was to disrupt the balance of the universe. But poison was not just the tool of the wicked. It was a force that nature itself could wield. A child eats berries in the woods, sickens, dies. A shepherd falls ill after a new herb blooms on the pasture. A cook touches wild mushrooms and never wakes. In each case, the cause might be natural, but the meaning was not. Perhaps it was a punishment, a sin not confessed, a saint not honored. The line between nature and judgment blurred often and deliberately. At the same time, medieval people were not as naive as we often assume. They knew that people could be murdered, that food could be tampered with, that power attracted danger, and that not all deaths were honest. The problem was proving it. Poison left no wounds, no blood on the hands, and in a time before forensic science, all one could do was observe. A flushed face, a sudden silence, a trembling hand. The victim often died without explanation, sometimes in days, sometimes in hours, and the suspicion would begin. Had they angered someone? Had a rival brought a gift too freely? Had the kitchen boy hesitated, just slightly, before serving the roast? Poison made every action suspicious, every kindness questionable, and every death political. In some corners of Christendom, the church took poison very seriously indeed, because to kill someone with a blade was terrible, yes, but to kill someone with poison, that was often seen as worse, because poison required planning, it required calculation, it required pretending, and in the medieval moral universe, pretending, hiding evil behind a smile, was the sin of Lucifer. The Inquisition would sometimes treat poison as sorcery. To poison a nobleman or a priest might be investigated not as a crime, but as heresy. There are records, from as early as the 9th century, of women burned not just for witchcraft, but specifically for being suspected of poisoning a neighbor's child. Even when no poison was found, even when the child simply died, in the minds of many, the poisoner was not a criminal. She was another, a person whose very presence upset the natural order. Old women, healers, herbalists, often those who understood the language of plants. The same women who made medicines were accused of making poisons, and sometimes they were, but more often they were simply convenient. A scapegoat when a fever took too long, or when a rich man's heir died too soon. And yet, there is something oddly intimate about poison. Even in its fear, it suggests closeness. A dagger might be wielded by a stranger, but poison, that came from a friend. It had to be offered, accepted, drunk, trusted. The victim had to welcome it in, which made it feel, to the medieval imagination, like a kind of betrayal worse than murder. Because what could be more cruel than letting someone you loved raise their own death to their lips? In city squares, you might see a man hawking charms against poison, a ring carved from staghorn, a pendant filled with dried rue, a tiny vial of something called bezoar, the stone from a goat's stomach, said to draw out any poison at all. Or, if you had money, you might purchase unicorn horn, sold by Norse merchants as shavings in waxed packets. None of it worked, of course, but it felt like armor. And when fear is quiet and constant, even a sliver of horn becomes a sword. In time, medieval physicians would try to catalogue poisons. They wrote long lists in Latin, giving each plant its character, its antidote, its signs. But the truth is, they were mostly guessing. The symptoms of poisoning overlapped with dozens of diseases, and often the only real evidence was a hunch, a sudden change in fortune, a political rival who smiled too much, a servant who left in the night. Poison lived in the spaces between what could be seen and what could be guessed. It lived in doubt, and so it lived everywhere. This was what poison meant to a medieval mind. It was not just a substance, it was a story. One told behind veils, in hushed voices, over emptied goblets and graves dug too quickly. It was the perfect murder, because it left nothing behind, except suspicion. Let us now open the cupboards of the past, not the ornate chests of kings, nor the reliquaries of saints. No. Tonight, we lift the lid on something quieter. A wooden box in the corner of an apothecary's shop, a bundle of dried leaves hanging from a crooked beam, a small ceramic jar sealed in beeswax, hidden behind the holy water. These are the poisons themselves, the tools of choice for the quiet killer. And they were not rare. They were not exotic. Many of them grew right in the monastery garden, beside the thyme, near the mint, and the names. They sound almost beautiful, whispered on parchment. Atropa belladonna, hemlock, aconitum, mandragora, arsenicum. Each one a slow story, a dark lullaby in the bloodstream. Let us begin with belladonna, the beautiful lady, a climbing plant with black berries that glisten like ink pearls, named, some say, for the Italian women who dropped its juice into their eyes to dilate the pupils, to look more seductive. It worked, yes, but too much, and the effects were stranger. Dry mouth, blurred vision, a racing heart, delirium, and finally, death. In high doses, belladonna shuts down the parasympathetic nervous system. In the Middle Ages, this simply meant they stared too long. They stopped sweating. They muttered things that didn't make sense. Then they were gone. To poison someone with belladonna was easy. A single berry might do it. The problem was dosage. Too little, and they merely hallucinated. Too much, and they vomited. But just right, they went mad. And then they stopped going at all. Next comes hemlock, the executioner's favorite. Famous even in the ancient world, thanks to Socrates. In the medieval period, hemlock grew almost everywhere. It disguised itself as a useful plant. It looked a bit like parsley. Its roots smelled faintly of mice. To the untrained eye, or the unlucky cook, it could be a fatal mistake. Hemlock doesn't kill instantly. It paralyzes slowly. First the legs, then the chest, and finally the lungs. But, and this was perhaps the worst of it, the mind remains clear. The victim knew what was happening and could do nothing. In old herbal manuscripts, monks would write warnings beside the drawing. This herb sleepeth the limbs. Take not into meat. And yet, it found its way into stews and courtrooms and late-night disputes that ended too quietly. And then arsenic, the poisoner's darling, a powder white as frost, tasteless, odorless, easily dissolved in wine. To many, it was almost alchemical, part metal, part earth. Arsenic did not grow. It had to be mined, refined, which gave it a reputation for being more intentional. Less mistake, more message. Its symptoms mimics nearly everything. Stomach cramps, vomiting, diarrhea, fever. It could look like cholera, or plague, or bad bread. And so, the perfect poison. In small doses, it was sometimes even prescribed, ironically, as a treatment for syphilis and skin ailments. But over time, the line between medicine and murder blurred. There were nobles who took arsenic every day, convinced it made them immune. There were monks who kept it sealed in silver flasks. And there were those, in Florence and Paris, who had entire families vanish, and no one could prove a thing. Next, aconite, also known as wolfsbane, a favorite of both hunters and poisoners. Its roots look like pale little fists. Its flowers are hooded, like monks in mourning. It was said to grow where Cerberus, the three-headed dog of Hades, let his spit touch the ground. A dramatic origin, but the symptoms were no less mythic. Tingling in the fingers, burning in the mouth, a sudden drop in heart rate, and a death so swift it often overtook prayers. It was sometimes smeared on arrowheads, fed to wolves, or in darker circles steeped in wine. In some chronicles, aconite is blamed for the deaths of rivals who collapsed mid-sentence, their lips foaming with white. Some said it was magic. Others knew better. It was just a plant, a beautiful, deadly one. And then there is mandrake. Oh, the mandrake. Rarely used, but often feared because of its legend. The root of the mandrake often resembles a human figure, limbs, torso, even a face, which led to beliefs that it could scream when pulled from the ground. A scream so terrible, it killed anyone who heard it. And so, when harvesting it, one tied the plant to a dog, covered one's ears, and let the dog do the dying. Did this ever happen? Perhaps not. But the fact that people believed it did tells us something deeper. Mandrake was used in love potions, sedatives, and the rarest of poisons, because in the right hands, it made people sleep so deeply they never woke. There were other poisons too. Nightshade, cousin to belladonna. Foxglove, used in heart treatments or assassinations. Lead lined many a goblet, unknowingly turning wine into slow poison. Mercury, used in alchemy, prescribed by bold physicians, and fatal in teaspoons. But perhaps most unsettling were the accidental poisons, the ones no one meant. Spoiled grain infected with ergot, which caused hallucinations and death. Contaminated water, mouldy meat. Many medieval poisonings weren't deliberate, but the victim still died, and someone was still blamed, because grief demands a villain, and in the absence of evidence, the mind will invent one. The poisons of the Middle Ages were not modern. They had no lab, no label, no law. They were flowers, powders, roots, and minerals. They were knowledge passed in whispers, and warnings carved in ink. Their victims were many, their traces few, and when they worked well, they left only questions behind. In the next chapter, we'll turn not to the poisoners, but to the ones who tried to prevent them. The testers, the tasters, the sniffers and watchers and wives who whispered, "Don't eat that." And we'll explore the rituals and absurdities that followed the fear. Because where poison was suspected, superstition followed like a shadow. There is a peculiar thing that happens once poison enters a story. Even the faintest suspicion, just a word or a look held too long, has the power to shift the air around a person. Suddenly, they are watched more closely. Food cools untouched. Wine is sniffed, then left half full. It wasn't always about proof. In the medieval world, suspicion was its own evidence, and sometimes it was the only warning you'd ever get. So let's step now into that shadowy middle ground, between intent and accident, between trust and silence, and meet the ones who tasted, sniffed, tested, and warned. Those who lived at the blurred edge of fear, the buffer between cup and lips, the medieval food testers. To be a food tester was not always a formal title. There was no silver badge, no parchment contract. Most were simply servants, kitchen boys, maids, people who knew too much about sauces, people who couldn't afford to say no. Before a meal was served, especially to someone important, a portion might be tested. A bit of bread torn off, a spoonful of stew, a sip of wine. Sometimes the tester was made to wait afterward, standing quietly in a corner while everyone else watched. 5 minutes, 10. If they didn't collapse or retch or begin to shake, then the meal was declared safe. One can imagine the silence during those moments. Knives resting, no one breathing, and the tester swallowing. Again. But there were more theatrical rituals too. In some courts, noble guests brought their own servants to test every bite. Forks were passed from hand to hand. Goblets sniffed by 3 different people. Even the salt might be checked, though it was hardly ever poisoned. At royal feasts, testers sometimes tasted not only food, but napkins. Chewing the corner, watching for itching or swelling. Because poison could be soaked into cloth as well as stirred into broth. Then there were amulets, jewelry said to change color in the presence of poison, a ring set with serpent stone, allegedly harvested from the head of a live snake, or pendants made from toad bones, unicorn horn, or what was sold as unicorn horn, which was usually narwhal tusk, shaved into dust and pressed into wax. It was expensive. It did absolutely nothing, but it made people feel just a little safer. There were antidotes too, though that word was generous. Most were mixtures of herbs, milk, and prayer. Some included powdered emerald or crushed crabs. The most famous antidote of all was theriac, a concoction of over 60 ingredients: cinnamon, opium, myrrh, viper flesh, boiled into a sticky paste, aged for years, and sold for a fortune. It was said to cure everything: plague, melancholy, treason. Kings kept it in golden jars. Doctors swore by it. Charlatans sold fakes by the cartload. It was, like so much else, largely useless. But in a world where poison was invisible, odorless, and tasteless, placebo was still a kind of power. Some relied on wise women instead. Local herbalists, midwives, or cunning folk. They knew which mushrooms burned the throat, which roots softened a fever. If you suspected poisoning, you didn't always go to a doctor. You went to a widow who lived on the edge of the forest. You paid in coins, or eggs, or silence, and she might hand you a tea, or a powder to mix into wine, or a ribbon to tie around your wrist, inscribed with a charm in Latin no one remembered how to read. Did it work? Sometimes, sometimes not. But it gave you something to do, and doing was better than waiting. Then there were those who didn't rely on magic or ritual at all. They relied on the look of a thing. A spoiled wine might turn cloudy. Meat that smelled wrong was fed to dogs. A strange taste might be masked by spice, and so food for the wealthy became more seasoned. Not always for pleasure, but for cover. Too much cinnamon, too much pepper. It wasn't a culinary flourish. It was caution. And as paranoia spread, the meals became increasingly complicated. Tasters, amulets, prayers, and sometimes a quiet message slipped into the ear of a lord. Don't eat tonight, the cook is new. Or dash, the stew was salted twice, and she didn't taste it. Little things, warnings that saved lives, or didn't. Of course, the irony is, the food testers themselves often knew nothing. They had no training, no knowledge of toxicology. They simply obeyed. And many times, they were poisoned first. A princess in Aragon once wept over her cupbearer. A boy who died after sampling a gift meant for her. The royal feast went on. The wine was replaced, and the musicians played softer that night. No one was ever accused. The boy was buried near the stables, and they hired another. Testing food was always a gamble, because poison wasn't always fast. Arsenic took hours. Lead took years. Some left symptoms days later. So even the most vigilant testing could miss the mark, which meant that most of what protected medieval diners was theatre, ceremony, a prayer over the wine, a sniff, a sip, a pause, a raised eyebrow, a servant's hesitation, a superstition passed through generations. Don't eat what you didn't watch them cook. Don't drink wine from a jug already opened. Don't trust stew from a smiling hand. Because poison didn't need to taste bitter. It only needed time. We often imagine poison as an assassin's tool, stealthy, precise, cruel. But in truth, it was also the weapon of the desperate, the powerless, the overlooked, and those who feared it were often the ones with the most to lose. Which brings us to our next chapter. The stories of real, imagined and exaggerated poisonings, where death was followed not just by silence, but by panic, because sometimes you didn't even need poison to kill, just the idea of it. We like to think of poisonings as rare, carefully planned, cold-blooded. But what happens to a society when poison becomes not just real, but believed? Let's drift now into the foggy realm of fear, where suspicion outpaces truth, where illness becomes accusation, and poison is not always in the cup, but in the eye of the beholder. In the 14th century, Europe began to shiver with paranoia, not just because of poison itself, but because of its ghost. The idea of it, the feeling that something unseen, unheard, untraceable had slipped inside the walls. It was during the Black Death especially that poison became a kind of explanation. Bodies fell in streets, children died in sleep. The rats were blamed, yes, but so were the neighbors. Whispers bloomed like mold in the corners of taverns. He was too healthy yesterday. She drank from a strange jug. They say the well water smells wrong. Suddenly, what had been illness became murder. Wise women, once healers, became suspects. Midwives were watched too closely. The line between remedy and poison blurred, then vanished entirely. An herbal tincture given in good faith became witch's brew. A poorly timed death became proof. And if your garden held belladonna or foxglove, well, you were lucky to keep your house from being burned. This wasn't justice. It was grief with no outlet. It was fear grasping for an answer. And poison, that invisible villain, made a perfect scapegoat. There were darker rumors too, organized ones. In France, during the plague years, Jewish communities were accused of poisoning wells, not just casually, but systematically, deliberately. These rumors spread like the sickness itself. Whole villages turned on their neighbors. Synagogues were burned. Men, women, and children were tortured into confessions that made no sense, under charges born from hysteria. In some towns, they executed dozens. In others, hundreds. None were guilty, not of poisoning anyway. But that didn't matter, because panic doesn't care about evidence. It only cares about relief. And if the mob must burn something to feel safe, it will. Even nobles were not immune to the fear. In Florence, Rome, and Paris, courtiers sometimes carried small coins stamped with crosses or prayers, said to protect the bearer from poison. Meals were taken in private. Guests were watched more closely. Gifts were refused, then burned, and yet the accusations still came. A bishop dies in his sleep. His cook is arrested. A queen vomits after supper. A maid vanishes by morning. A noblewoman miscarries. Her midwife is thrown into the river. Sometimes no poison was found. No foul play confirmed. But suspicion lingers longer than poison ever could. The texts themselves are strange. Medieval physicians wrote about poison in ways both practical and mystical. Some spoke of hot and cold poisons, venoms that heated the blood or froze it. Others describe poisons that entered through dreams or through the evil eye. In the Physica of Hildegard of Bingen, one reads of the soul being clouded by venom. In another text, a cure is suggested, not a tonic, but confession and prayer. It wasn't always about toxins. It was about wrongness, about moral rot, spiritual disease. And so poisoning became not just a crime, but a sin. The irony, of course, is that the imagined poisoning sometimes protected people from the real ones. A noble who delayed his meal because he had a feeling might survive. A lady who avoided shared wine might escape a rival's attempt. Superstition, for all its flaws, gave people an excuse to be cautious. But it also made every illness suspect, every death political, every stomach cramp a signal. Even food testers, those poor souls, became suspects when they lived too long. How did he survive if it was poisoned? Maybe he was in on it, and so the fear fed itself, round and round, until poison became a presence in every chamber, even when it had never been poured. There were even saints of poisoning. Saint Benedict was said to have been given poisoned wine by jealous monks, but when he blessed the cup, it shattered. Saint John was offered poisoned oil, drank it without harm, and converted the poisoner on the spot. These were miracles, yes, but they were also wishful thinking, proof that the righteous could not be harmed. That poison, that cowardly shadow, had no hold on the truly faithful. It made a comforting story, and in a world where so many died in silence, comfort mattered. In the end, the imagined poisonings may have shaped history as much as the real ones, because fear creates behavior. It changes how people speak, how they eat, how they trust. It rewrites relationships. It silences confessions. It sparks wars. And sometimes, in the deepest irony of all, the one blamed for the poison isn't the one who gave it, but the one who noticed. Some deaths in history roar like lions. Others pass like mist across glass. But those touched by poison, they tend to leave only whispers, and it is those whispers that echo longest. Let's follow them, shall we? Down corridors where no footsteps ring, across pages where no name is written, into silences too deliberate to be honest. Poison never needed a body to be real. Sometimes, all it needed was suspicion. Even centuries later, you'll find cases where no proof was ever offered. And yet, everyone knew. They'll say, he didn't just fall ill, not after that wedding. She had enemies in court. That's how these things happen. The doctor came too quickly. You'll find these murmurs in dusty letters, in the margins of estate rolls, in forgotten court records where a steward took ill and the case was closed. The truth wasn't always sought, because the truth was rarely safe. Scene, candlelit chamber. An aging noblewoman sits by a window, staring out over the dark. There were, of course, people who survived poisonings, or thought they had. You'll find strange entries in almanacs and household books. May 7th, slight sourness in the wine. Poured it away. October 2nd, Mary reports pain after broth. Sack of herbs buried. December 12th, cat dead by morning. Cook dismissed. A world lived just to the side of panic. One toe always on the threshold of fear. The other inside the warm room, hoping, desperately, that nothing had followed it in. It was easier to let things go unsaid, safer. When a duke died suddenly, his widow might weep publicly, mourn privately, and say nothing at all. When a cardinal fell to illness after a feast, no fingers were pointed. Why? Because to accuse someone of poisoning was to accuse someone powerful, and to accuse without proof was a death sentence all its own. So people learned to live with silence, to eat with caution, to speak in riddles. The danger wasn't just in the food, it was in the naming. Even centuries later, poison still keeps its secrets. We don't always know what killed them. We speculate. Historians, doctors, sleuths. We pieced together symptoms from scattered descriptions. He sweated and could not breathe. She lost her voice, then her skin blackened. They all died within the hour. Was it poison? Or plague? Or panic? We will never know, because the records weren't written to reveal. They were written to move on. And yet, despite the centuries, we still feel their presence. Not the poisoners necessarily, but the ones left behind. The sister who always wondered, the servant who buried the silver cup, the scribe who hesitated before writing natural causes. They linger in ink, in silence, in the way certain names are never spoken aloud. That's what poison does. It leaves no visible wound, only doubt. And sometimes that's far more lasting. In some ways, poison is the most human of crimes. It requires forethought, timing, an understanding of the body, a willingness to watch someone suffer quietly. But it also requires something else, distance. Unlike a sword, there is no heat, no recoil, no struggle. The victim and the killer may never even lock eyes. That's what makes it so chilling, and what made it so effective. Because in courts and castles, in kitchens and cloisters, there was always someone listening, always someone watching, and always someone who knew how to mix just enough. And now, as we close this long wandering through the shaded corners of history, remember this. Poison was never just about death. It was about control. It was about removing someone quietly, without noise, without rebellion, without proof. It is a crime of silence. And perhaps that's why we find it so fascinating still, because in a world filled with loud, clumsy ends, poison offers a whisper, and we always lean in to hear it. Thank you for spending this quiet hour with me, wandering the strange and forgotten corridors of medieval life. If you enjoyed this story, I'd be ever so grateful if you'd leave a like and subscribe. It helps keep these quiet tales alive. And please, let me know in the comments where in the world you're watching from tonight. It's a quiet joy to see the reach of history in such peaceful company. Until next time, rest well, stay curious, and do be careful who prepares your dinner. And so, we leave the feast behind, the bones picked clean, the wine jugs empty, and the tester, hopefully, still upright. The great hall darkens, the fires die down, and in some quiet corner, a man with a nervous stomach considers whether that last bite of venison was truly safe, or just very well disguised. Thank you for joining me on this gentle stroll through the curious world of medieval food and drink testers. Until next time, eat slowly, sip cautiously, and never offend your cook.